So, Mr. Rock, the first thing that I really wanted to get into was about your family origins and background. Like, how did you come to be in the city of Boston?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you asked that. Family background is phenomenal. I guess I can call myself second generation Bostonian. When I say second, for me, myself, second generation Bostonian, because my grandmother and grandfather were immigrants from Barbados, and they came to Boston, and I guess in the teens, in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken. And from there, they came and moved to Roxbury, and then to the South End, and bought a home in the South End, now called the South End, but at the time was Roxbury on Shawmut Ave and Northampton Street, right there on the corner at 553 Shawmut Avenue. I know it like it was yesterday, and that's where I pretty much grew up. In my grandmother and grandfather's house. My mom's obviously was there, but she would send us off to my grandmother and grandfather. And most of my experience is essentially a West Indian experience, a Bayesian experience, a Barbados experience because of their roots in Barbados. I'm one of the grandchildren of the grandmother and grandfather. And let's see. Um, yeah, so that's it. Yeah, the South End, Roxbury. Grew up in the South End community my early years, and then as my mother moved from Brookledge Street in, I guess in essentially a let us call it a Jewish neighborhood at the time. The majority of the folks that lived there were Jewish. We were one of two black families on Brookledge Street in the 1950s. And I spent most of my time, as I said, down in the South End, though.
Wow, yeah. So the South End is actually where my mother ended up when she first came to Boston.
Yes.
She was living in the, I guess we call it the nursing, kind of like the nursing tower dorm off of
Right,
Mass
right.
Ave. Yeah, so
Uh-huh.
that's also, maybe our shared connection is this
That's right.
starting point in Boston at
Exactly.
the South End.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with that said, I mean, this era of the 50s and 60s is so
Mhm.
historically important in terms of the Black freedom struggle, civil rights movement, the sort of growth and development of the Black Power movement. Were you aware of those things at the time, or did you have a kind of a sense for the the levels of organizing that were going around the country at the time?
Oh yeah, I became aware of it when my mom's and dad moved to essentially um, up to the up well down further to Dorchester, and lived over there on Woodbine or Woodcliff Street in Dorchester. When they moved there, I was a teen, and as a teen, I first got connected with the education issue with working for uh, Ellen Jackson. And Ellen Jackson was a educational activist of the time, and I worked for her as a teen. I think I was about 12 years old, working for her as a teen, actually just cleaning the offices of Operation Exodus. And doing that, she would ask me questions about what I thought about the school system that was de facto segregated. And she would teach me about segregation. She also shared with me books that I needed to read. And obviously, one of the books was Malcolm X. I don't say obviously, but don't mean obviously. But Malcolm X was one of the books that she wanted me to read. She also wanted me to read a lot of information on the school system in Boston. And so I was able to read and learn at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old working with Ellen Jackson.
Wow, that's so Operation Exodus is definitely something that is significant in terms of Boston's history. Could you kind of describe what Operation Exodus was?
Yeah, Operation Exodus essentially was a program to get people that were in de facto segregated schools, essentially impacted in Roxbury, Dorchester, and parts of Mattapan at the time. Black folks living there and having poor educational opportunity. She wanted to move people outside of the Boston community and go into Brookline and other places to be able to get a quality of education as well. So she wanted to essentially bus people from one location, poor neighborhood of Roxbury, into better schools and better neighborhoods throughout the metropolitan area. And that was Operation Exodus. Let's exit out of the current Boston school system because it's dysfunctional and not working. Archaic.
So the tactic essentially though was that it was taking students from like underfunded schools to schools that had better funding essentially because the majority of the student population was white, correct?
Correct.
Right. So
Yes.
that also leads me to so at the time, this is pre high school. What was your experience like at that age with the sort of like elementary and middle school level?
Yeah, mine was that what you just mentioned. Essentially, it was a school system that didn't function well, and for me, the academic experience was horrific. When I say horrific, I went to elementary school. Over my first school was the William Lloyd Garrison School in Boston, in the Dorchester section, as I said, on Brookledge Street. And I remember an experience with my mom's and my sister and my brothers. We had were playing inside the school after hours, and we had chalk, and we were playing as kids, mocked up the schoolyard with places where we wanted to play hopscotch and all sorts of other stuff. The next day, the teacher and the principal told us that we would be suspended because of the fact that we went into a community school and actually used it to play in. And they yelled and screamed at us. We came back home. We were emotionally distraught. My mother immediately the next day went up to the school system and said, "Hey, guess what? This is a community school." She didn't even know the terminology, but she used it. She said, "This is a community school. This school is in the community. And my kids who live right next door to the school should have access to the school." And that's just to play in, let alone the education that was not going on. And when I say that, I'm saying that I remember the books were always in disrepair. We always got second and third class books, essentially old books, 10, 15 years old. The old books of the Watch Mary Run, Watch Johnny Run, those types of books. They were old, they were archaic, and they needed new books, and we didn't have them. We used it over and over and over again. And I do remember having old books and just totally in disrepair, and that's just how the school system was. Essentially, majority white teachers, majority women white teachers, and that's not to insult women or white teachers, that's just to say the school system was as segregated as the students that had to go to predominantly black schools versus predominantly white schools.
Right. Yeah. So that's another thing too that that comes up a lot in the history is that essentially, part of the later struggle is for there to be essentially a way of populating these schools with teachers of color, black teachers in particular, because there's so few in the district.
Right.
Even
Exactly.
Yeah, even now I think it's kind of like it's obviously it's improved, but
Mhm.
I don't think it actually is reflective of what the student demographics are,
Definitely
considering
not.
how high percentage of black and other students of color we have. The teacher population isn't reflective of that, and as far as I know, it's historically never been.
It has never been, and actually, you bring up a great point, and that was the whole issue that Ellen Jackson and Muriel Naudio Snowden and so many black leaders and educators at the time, Mel King, we all advocated, even though I was the younger one, we all advocated for opportunities for people, particularly black students and Latino students and others, because there was a large population of Puerto Ricans at the time, as well as blacks at the time, in the school system, and we wanted to make sure that they had access to quality teachers as well, black teachers. I'm reminded that in the 1960s there was only 17 black teachers in the whole school system. Yeah, and we knew them by name.
Yeah, so I want to kind of get going towards this direction too. So we talked about Operation Exodus, and when you're around 12 years old, and I want to kind of get into your experience of Boston Trade School as well. So,
Hmm.
first, why did you choose Boston Trade School as kind of the direction to go in? And then, could you also kind of tell us about what happens when you get there? What are the conditions you find?
Yeah.
And what was your experience like?
Yeah, well, let me go backwards for a second and talk about my elementary school years because that was impactful on my decision to go to Boston Trade. Um, Earlier on in my education, I was challenged, and the challenge was is that I didn't know, nor did my parents understand that I had dyslexia. In the 1950s, dyslexia was not even a known commodity, a known challenge. And so when kids went to school and they had challenges in reading and writing, many times they were told that they weren't capable of doing the work. And if you weren't capable in doing the work, you would be kept back, essentially told that you had to repeat the class. In the second grade and in the fourth grade, I found myself having to repeat the class. Essentially, school year, having to be kept back in the second and fourth grades. So, all of the people that I grew up with advanced 2 years before me because of my dyslexia, because of the challenge I had and the inability or unwillingness of the school system to address the challenge. Now we have IEPs. Now we have individualized educational plans, but in the 1950s that didn't happen. So that challenge actually walked with me through my educational experience, particularly during my early educational years. It was impactful to me. It was tough. It was a tough experience. And then there was a challenge of stratifying kids in elementary school. In elementary schools across the city of Boston, they stratified kids: A group, B group, C group, and D group. That was A group was you were extremely competent in what you were able to do educationally. B group, not so much, but you were okay. C group was the challenge group. This is a group of folks that were having educational challenges. By the way, it could have been dyslexia, it could have been attention disorder issues, but they were real and they didn't address them. They put them in the C group or D group. So for my years, I was always in the C group. And that was, I wanted to work. I was interested in educational experiences, but I was always in that C group throughout my educational experience in the Boston public school system. That leads me to the whole issue of what the decision I made regarding a high school after, graduating from the Dearborn in on Ambrose Street, where we grew up during my teenage years in public housing over at the Orchard Park. And I made a decision. The decision was, well, with my dad, he says, you got to get a trade. You got to get something behind you, under your belt, to be able to survive in this world and grow in this world. And I said, yeah, I'll go to trade, but I'm really interested in English. And, I snuck away from trade for a minute and said, I'm going to English. I went over to English, and the English folks said, hey, guess what? You're not registered here. You're registered at trade school. Why are you coming here? I said, because I want to go to English High. They said, I'm sorry, but you're out of here. You got to go to trade. So that's what I did. The next day I went to trade school, but I loved the fact that I really wanted to go to English, but went to trade. Trade school was a phenomenal institution in terms of trade training, but the school system across the board had all white teachers telling all black, essentially predominantly black trade school at the time what they needed to do in terms of education. And there was, I think, Mr. Marshall. There was two black teachers in the whole school system, in the whole school over at Boston Trade. Two black teachers.
Wow. Yeah. So this is interesting too. So with trade school, we're talking about like a majority black student population, majority white teachers,
Mm-hmm.
and can you describe too like kind of like what's your experience like in terms of attending during that time, like relationships between students, teachers?
Yeah, relationships between students was excellent. The average, regular, conflicts, because guess what? These folks that are plumbers, electricians, carpenters, sheet metal workers, draftsmen, which I was, and so many other different trades, essentially trades where you use your hands. So, folks that use their hands from time to time would have conflicts. And in using their hands, they took it out in their conflicts with their fists. They didn't, there was no guns, there was fists. Fists would fly from time to time. You go out to the schoolyard, and then after that, it's over, it's done. Because it was boys' trade school, there were boys, or turning in boys to men, turning into men, and men know how to essentially have a conflict and then let it go. So you have a conflict with something or how they did something, and then after it, it's over. So in terms of relationships, there could be from time to time conflicts. Generally speaking, no black or white conflicts. It was human being conflicts. There was hardly any conflict with the students. Now, with regards to the teachers, like in elementary school, trade school was on the verge when I was in trade school of changing corporal punishment. Corporal punishment was alive and well in the 1950s and 60s in Boston. Corporate punishment essentially is that teachers had the ability to physically punish kids for what they perceived as acting out or not being responsive to administration's request for something. So what would happen is we would get struck in the hand with, I would call it as a dowel. It's essentially a thin piece, a strip of wood, and that dowel, that strip of wood that could be a yard long, was dipped into vinegar. And when a student acted out for whatever reason, the teacher would tell them to go outside and wait for them. And the teacher would tell the student to put their hand out, and they would get strikes on the hand, usually around 10 times. Many times, because of the vinegar and them wanting it to sting, it would bleed. And the bleeding was bad. And this happened in the whole school system. That was the 1950s and early 60s in Boston's public school system.
Wow. Did that continue on even towards high school where you have kind of like
Yeah.
older.
It happened. It went on to high school until I believe about 1968, 69, when radicalization of the Boston public schools was happening and students weren't taking it anymore. And some students actually were in fist fights with the teachers because of corporal punishment. And the school system finally rejected it as pretty much inappropriate, inefficient, and pretty much unconstitutional.
Yeah, that would make that would make sense. It feels like a pretty blatant violation to be essentially torturing students for.
Torturing students
Yeah,
for what they perceived as misconduct.
right. Yeah. So with trade school, is trade school initially kind of where you have your kind of like your entry point into the organizing, the student organizing?
Actually, I would say when Ellen Jackson had me under her wings, that was the time that I learned about the importance of student organizing and essentially parent organizing, student organizing, community organizing. She gave me an understanding of how that was to occur, what was the best approaches to make sure that that occurred. And then after that, after learning about it and essentially going and working with Action for Boston Community Development, ABCD, back in the day, I even learned more about community organizing as a teen. And so when I got into high school, you are correct. That was in many ways the big picture impetus for me to begin to organize students.
Right. So because I know from the history that you do have a confrontation with an adult staff member
Hmm.
at Boston Trade. Um, was were you doing organizing prior to that to address conditions, or was that mostly following the incident with one of the adult staff members at Boston Trade?
Yeah, that was an unfortunate incident. I remember it like it was yesterday. That was an incident that caused a lot of pain for me, probably some pain for the teacher, but a lot of pain for my family. And that was that I had an experience over at Boston Trade with one of the teachers. And the teacher, I was in the room at the sheet metal class actually, put my hand up to Mr. Flanagan. And I said, Mr. Flanagan, I got a question for you regarding this sheet metal thing that he was explaining. And I was in the back of the class. And Mr. Flanagan, Mr. Flanagan, He said to me, like he had done in a number of occasions, "Be quiet, ink spot." I'm a dark skinned dude. When I heard that, obviously it was bigoted, it was racist, but he called me ink spot. And all the kids, all the youngsters, all the folks in the classroom laughed. And all boys, all men. And I wasn't going to take it anymore. That was the last straw. That was the third comment that he had made. I ran up in front of the classroom, collared him, and said, don't you ever call me an ink spot again." He yelled and screamed and said, "Get off of me." And I pushed him backwards, and I ran out of the classroom. They contacted area police. That is right around the corner, actually. Police came, caught me outside, arrested me, and we settled it um, in court and out of court. But it was now that I realized what was going on. It's that whole chain of events that happens with a lot of students in regards to all of a sudden they find themselves in the criminal justice system and the prison pipeline from high school, junior high. You find yourself in that pipeline. And I was one of those people, and I didn't understand it at that particular moment in time, but I do now. Is that that was a case of a black kid getting in the criminal pipeline. Thank God I had a great moms and a great dad that could afford an attorney to represent me to say, guess what? He induced the situation. He started calling racist names to me, and it was dismissed. But the bottom line is, it was impactful and began me to understand the importance of organizing with students. And so that was the long story, but it's the short story in reality about how racism impacts even the quietest. And I was a quiet student too, the quietest of students.
Yeah. So, because um, it seems like when you kind of like look back on the history of really, I mean, the black community in Boston, that these incidents aren't unique at the time. Was the impression in the city, in the school system, that these were like fairly common occurrences where essentially being disrespected, being forced in these confrontations were fairly normal for black students in the city of Boston?
Oh yeah, they were extremely normal. English High was a clear example. JP High was another example. Jeremiah Burke was another example. There was a combination of challenges because of de facto segregation, the segregation of black students essentially in the whole school system, where there was a black essentially a black education and a white education. And with the black education in black schools, we were segregated by black students and segregated by white teachers that essentially could give a royal, yeah, you know the other part, about us and the importance of making sure that we are fully engaged in our own education.
So, so that's like the kind of like the build up to this other part of history, the 68 to 71 span of time where we have, kind of a explosion of student organizing across the city, the formation of the Black Student Federation and Black Student Union. Um, how can you kind of like fill us in essentially from like your experience at trade to your role with the Black Student Federation, like what was happening?
What was going on? Well, good point. Unfortunately, I got to give you this because it's part of the experience. Is unfortunately because of the incident that happened over at Boston Trade School, I made a calculated decision, and I made it in conjunction with my family, but mother and father. But they weren't. They were understood, but didn't want me to do it. And that is, I was forced out of school. I don't consider myself a dropout. I consider myself a force out. When that situation happened with Mr. Flanagan, um, I made a calculated decision that I didn't want to go back to that school again. It wasn't because I was suspended. I was not. It was because of the incident that occurred, and incidences that had occurred over a 2 year period or 1.5 year period over at Boston Trade. I decided to drop out, and I went to work. And I went to work over, I believe, at Tufts University Medical Center. Kind of, sort of, just a job, to have a job because my mother required it. She said, "Hey, guess what? If you're going to drop out, you got to work." And so that's what I did. I went to work, but unhappy at where I was. And I started going over at after work to the Black United Front, which was a black organization of black activists created back in the 60s, 67, 66, that type of thing. And I learned about, the black student organization that was right next door was called the Black Student Federation, essentially a federation of black students from colleges and universities across the region, across Boston. And as well, they were attempting to establish the Black Student Federation to be a activist group for the high schools as well. But they didn't have as much connection with the high schools that they would have liked to. So they said, "Hey, Rock, you been in the school system before. I know you dropped out of school, but how would you like to start organizing inside the schools?" And I said, "I'm game. Let's do it." And that's what, the person that was heading up the Black Student Federation of the time was Omeka Agu, and phenomenal guy, a student at one of the colleges, I believe was Northeastern. And he said, "Hey, guess what? Well, I want you to be my right hand man in organizing in the schools across the city." And I said, "You got it. Let's do it." So I got excited and started organizing in the schools. And one of the schools that I began organizing in was English High School, the place that I always wanted to be anyway. So I started organizing, giving out leaflets and flyers on coming to Black Student Union meetings that were held at 90 Warren Street, the offices of the Black Student Federation. And students began to come because it was that period in time. Black Panthers were around, the Mau Mau was around, Republic of New Africa was around, CORE was around, SNCC was around. All these organizations, all these activist organizations were up on Blue Hill Avenue, but I was the outreach person for the Black Student Federation at the time, and that's how I got involved. Even as a person that had dropped out of school, I went back to start organizing. I was still a youngster too, so I went back and started organizing for the Black Student Federation.
Wow. Yeah. So that's because I was going to ask you a question too. That in our era, it's we have the text message, we have the email. Was the majority of the way that you were kind of reaching students was essentially going to them and flyering, kind of like after school, or finding people to kind of like put them on to the Black Student Federation?
Yeah, and actually, you brought me back to a time where we had mimeograph machines. You youngsters now would never know it. You probably don't even know what a mimeograph machine is yourself. But essentially, it's a sheet of blue paper, and you put it on a essentially a tube, and the tube would go around, and you would have a handle, and you would have ink, and you would mimeograph, essentially print, flyers. And essentially, this mimeograph, or this essentially blue sheet, you can write almost anything, usually handwritten, but sometimes you could type on it, and you would print it out because there was no such things as Xerox copying at the time. So you mimeographed. And so we would mimeograph maybe 500 sheets of paper and say, hey, guess what? We got the information. The information is about a rally that we're going to have to ask for more black teachers in the school system, to ask for more black guidance counselors. Essentially, let's demand some things of the school system and see how they respond. And by the way, Louise Day Hicks was on the school committee. John Kerrigan was on the school committee. A bunch of people that are known historically for their bigotry was on the school system at the time as a school board.
Right. Yeah, and that came up too. I mean, it comes up over and over again in the history about the school committee and their willingness to use whatever means possible to ensure compliance of black students, from like police in schools to I think they wanted to call the National Guard at one point over
That's
student
right.
protests.
Yes,
So
yes.
so yeah, so I was just
Yeah,
wondering, could you tell us a little bit about the school committee at the time, um,
yeah.
in addition to what you told us already?
Yeah, well, as I said, the school committee had Louise Day Hicks, John Kerrigan, Craven, let me see, Tyranny, and a bunch of others. Tyranny was the most liberal of the school committee people. Louise Day Hicks was one of the more aggressive, bigoted folks. And this is not to say that South Boston had its challenges at the time, and the challenges were directly from Louise Day Hicks. She would call us as African Americans monkeys, say all sorts of divisive, arrogant, abrasive things to black Bostonians, said that she would never meet with the NAACP. And by the way, who says that they won't meet with the NAACP? I mean, yeah. She said that she would not support school desegregation. She said that school desegregation was a red herring issue. That schools were not racially imbalanced. The black community of Boston, through the NAACP, attempted to negotiate with the school committee to say, hey, guess what? We need to do something to make sure that educational inequality stops in Boston. And the school committee balked at it. I'm very familiar with it. And then there was a time where the NAACP, the Black Student Federation, and others came together and said, hey, guess what? We can't deal with this anymore. We need to hold them accountable with the racial imbalance law, a state law that says essentially that schools cannot be in balance based on race. They have to be balanced. You have to integrate the school system. And, she balked at it and said, hey, guess what? I'm never, ever in my life, I'll die first before I have my community of South Boston go into Roxbury, where those, yeah, she called them monkeys, live. And that's how divisive it was. It's similar to what we're experiencing now with the United States Congress, but think of the United States Congress, the Republicans on the United States Congress being in the Boston public schools. That's essentially what we're experiencing now, and that's what we experienced back in the 1960s, early 70s.
I think that's important to note too, because this is what student organizing has to confront, is essentially this committee that's not even willing to humor a conversation with black parents, the NAACP, or any real representatives of the black community. It seems like at the
Right,
time.
right.
Um, and so this is where I wanted to kind of to get into the organizing component, from the 68 to 71 period. From what I understand, the sort of like movement, the black student kind of protest at English High starts out what seems like kind of a conversation between Glenn Grayson and a few other young men. And the first form of protest was to show up with dashikis on and kind of like
Correct.
traditional African clothing, right?
Yes.
And then it's like it's a big group of boys, but then the day of, it's two people. It's Glenn Grayson, one other person.
Hmm.
Were you aware of this action when it happened, and kind of the direct after effects of it?
Yeah, it was direct after effects of it. Actually, yeah, there were a number of people that were activists at English High. And one of those individuals that was an activist at English High actually was sharing the literature of organizing. They were action organizers. They knew what action needed to take place, and they organized based on what they believed was important action that needed to take place. And that was that the voices of discontent of the school administration had to be heard. And in 1968, it was an activist moment. It was like, well, wait a minute. Everybody was wearing dashikis, wearing large afros, looking very militant, and it developed at English High as well. And the English high school students, including Ed Crowder, who was a leader at English High, said, hey, let's what? We need to demonstrate. Let's talk with the school administration and tell them that we want to wear dashikis. We don't want to wear just regular clothes anymore in that sense of the word. We want to wear dashikis. Actually, let's go and do it. Let's go to Nubian Notion where dashikis were, and let's go buy some dashikis or have our parents buy them or make them, and let's come back and let's wear those dashikis. Well, folks wore dashikis and they were suspended for wearing dashikis. Uh-oh. We learn about this. The African American, excuse me, the Black Student Federation actually learns about this and says, "Hey, guess what, Rock? We got to start organizing over at English High." I said, "Cool, let me go right now." The next day, I was over at English High, agitating as well, saying that the school system was, as I say, even now, archaic and outdated. And guess what? You can't tell people what they can wear as long as, and it represents us. It's dashikis. Come on now. And there was a demonstration and another demonstration and another demonstration. And then there was a point where we said, you know what? The Black Student Federation is going to call for a boycott of the schools. We need to boycott the schools. The boycott kind of, sort of, became reality for English high school students. For a couple of days, they boycotted, but they went back to school. And so that was essentially part of the impetus that grew up over a number of years until 1970. Latter part of 1970, students continued to grow. The level of student activism began to grow. And we not only impacted on English, we went to Hyde Park, Roslindale, actually the majority of black student high schools across the city. And in going to each one of the schools, we said we got some demands of the school administration, and let's organize around it. And we're going to call for a student boycott. And I believe it was February of 71 began the original black student boycott. One of the first black student boycotts in the city of Boston's history. One of the first. There was a parent boycott in 63, 64, but there was never a black student boycott until 1971.
Right. So this is a question too about sort of the organizing and coordination component. You have English High, JP, all these other schools
Mm-hmm.
where there's this radical energy and these young activist students. Is the Black Student Federation kind of like a way of keeping the coordination going between all these different school sites at the time?
Correct. It is a federation of black student unions. So, what we did was we organized black student unions in all the high schools where it was decentralized, where essentially black students met at the school sometimes, but sometimes the school system would not allow the black students to be a club, a black student club, because they said, well, you can't have a school club that discriminates against other people. So they used that as an excuse not to allow the black student union to be established and meet at the schools. So we allowed the students to meet at 90 Warren Street. And so as we developed black student unions, they would come to 90 Warren Street on specific days and specific times to actually continue their organizational development and structure. So each school had a black student union in it. JP, Jeremiah E. Burke, Girls High, Boston Trade. Everybody had a black student union in it.
Right. So there's a couple of things to get into with that, because from what I know, the official recognition of the Black Student Union at individual schools was highly contentious for just about every side I can think of. So it was something that was contentious. It was kind of framed as almost being like a reverse racist type of thing where y'all are banning certain demographics of students from these spaces, and um,
Correct.
it was not seen as a harmless affinity group essentially.
Right, right.
um, it was, and again, I think that's something too for the present that's important to think of, is how much hostility that idea was met with. And one of the things too that's really big with this is that I know that English High in particular had specific demands. Was the Black Student Federation kind of supporting students in terms of like articulating these demands, or were they like individual Black student unions kind of came up with their own?
Yeah, individual black student unions came up with their own initially. So, as an example, English High came up with their own through the leadership of Ed Crowder and others that you mentioned. Uh, on their own with the leadership inside the school as well as the student body. They were able to do their thing. Actually, English High is considered the leader of the movement. That's where it all began, and essentially. And then from there, what we did was we expanded on English High's actual demands and incorporated it as a citywide demand. So English High led the effort in many ways, and we built upon English High's demands, and their demands were consistent with what we had developed in 1971. essentially baseline, same thing, more black teachers, more black guidance counselors, more black cultural events. And I guess we had 4 or 5 specific demands that were met. Actually, as I look backwards, they were met, but met with lots of skepticism and met with a hard work on the part of the black students that stayed out for almost 3 or 4 months out of the school system.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One thing is that I know Black Studies is prominent in this. Essentially, at the time we have the kind of nationwide. There's organizing in college campuses,
Mhm. Mhm.
some secondary institutions as well. Were y'all aware of that movement too for that demand of Black Studies at the time, and kind of connected with higher
Yes.
higher learning too?
Yes, actually, we were aware of the importance of Black Studies programs. Actually, we were essentially in the same line of the black students at Northeastern University, black students at BU, black students at BC, all demanding black studies. So we were, and by the way, we were meeting with the same group. I mean, essentially, it was the Federation was a collective of college students and high school students. So the good thing was is that by the 1970s, early 1970s, we understood how to demand certain things because we learned from the folks that were going to Tufts University saying the same thing and them assisting us in putting down on paper what the demands should be, particularly around black studies, the importance of black studies, what were the core elements of the black studies program that we would propose, what was the best practices out in California, out in Oregon, out in other parts of the West Coast that were gearing up with Black Studies programs, and how could we make sure that that learning curve for what they were doing on the West Coast could come over to the East Coast. So, good points and good questions.
And to expand on that too, one of the things that I assume probably is kind of similar to our times nowadays, but what exactly did come of that demand? Was the district or any school able to create a Black Studies class, not a club, or allow a club,
Mm-hmm.
which essentially again was like self guided with students? But did any school site actually create a Black Studies course or class for any period of time?
Yeah. Let me recollect for a second the fact that the school system did agree with the demand of creating a Black Studies program, and had actually asked the folks over at the central office to come up with a Black Studies program curriculum. And I forget the name of the gentleman, but there was a black leader, black teacher organization, not Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, but the before them, there was a teacher that took total responsibility for putting together the curriculum for a Black Studies program. And if I'm not mistaken, it was also given to John D. O'Brien to come up with the curriculum as well. So there was essentially John D. O'Brien was the chairman at the time of the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts. Now I'm getting it. And then there was a teacher, a black teacher, who was well respected, and I will remember his name in a moment. But they both were put together to put in the the Black Studies program. Was it fully implemented? No. No, it took a while. It took to, I believe, 1974 or 75 to actually implement. And I remember as well, and so I'm going backwards for a minute, and you made me even think even more. Chuck Turner he was heading up uh, what do you call it? Northeastern University's Afro American Center, and he was part of the planning process for the Black Studies program for the city of Boston as well. So that combination of three leaders was, Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, John D. O'Brien being the chairperson, um, uh, Chuck Turner over at Northeastern, and then the teaching leader over at the Boston Public Schools. Those three coming together and coming up with a Black Studies program.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting to know because I've heard. I mean, this is a historical thing that continues on from the '70s. Is that this demand for Black studies comes up, and usually there is some work done on it somewhere. So somebody will suggest a curriculum, develop something, but what I haven't ever really seen is implementation.
Yeah, and it was not implemented. So, yeah, you've raised an excellent question. Well, you say that the demands were met. They were. At the time, we asked that they create. And so they began to create, but in terms of implementation, it was limited implementation.
Right. So yeah, this is like a rich period of time too, and I've heard stories, and I want to kind of, hear a little bit more about, especially what happens in that like the 70 to 71 school year.
Hmm.
We have the boycott, right? When and
Yes.
Mel King is the person who does call the kind of school wide boycott.
71, no, actually, Mel King supported the 1971 boycott, but it was the Student Federation that called the 71 school boycott. It was actually students that called for the boycott of the City of Boston schools. That was, I believe, February 4th, 1971, some 50 plus years ago.
Right. So with this point too, obviously school leaders and the school committee are not fond of the Black Student Federation or any
Mhm.
disruption whatsoever.
Right.
Um, what was the response like essentially from other organizations, the teachers organizations, NAACP, like what was their kind of general stance on the school boycott and
Mhm.
the student activism?
Yeah, glad you asked that. The NAACP was totally in support of us. Jackie Robinson was the head of the NAACP at the time. He was a no joke. In many ways, and he gave us comic relief at points. And I just got to tell you, one time, and I'm reminded by Anthony Banks, who was the vice chairman of the Black Student Federation and Black Student Union. He mentioned and reminded me of the fact that Jackie Robinson was so supportive of us that one time the school committee had said that they wanted me and others arrested because of the fact that we were causing kids to stay out of school in violation of truancy laws. And they asked for the attorney general at the time for the state to investigate me and others on, and so Jackie Robinson at a press conference said that he is in support of the school boycott, in support of the black students. And Louise Day Hicks and others had said that I needed to be arrested. And Jackie Robinson, who had a legal gun permit, at the press conference, put his gun, his legal gun permitted gun, because he was a businessman, he was a construction guy. He put his gun on the podium and said, and anybody messes with Rock or any of the other students here, they will have to hear from me. And slammed his gun down. I was like, and Anthony was like, and we were like, wow, did he just do this? We were like, wow, we didn't know that we had that level of support. It was flair, it was stuff, but it was impactful. That's how radical the 1960s and early 70s was. That you had an NAACP president that would go to that length to say, hey, guess what? Don't mess with these young people. Mel King supported us in totality from the beginning. He would bring us to the what is called the. He used to be head of the Urban League, so the New Urban League of Greater Boston was on Warren Street, and he would bring us into meetings where we would discuss strategies on how to implement our demands, how to actually engage the Boston School Committee. Black Educators Alliance supported us. Otto and Muriel Snowden of the Freedom House supported us. Ellen Jackson supported us. I mean, we got a wide range of support throughout the African American community. The Freedom House, and Alma Lewis, everybody was just amazing at supporting the black students. The city of Boston was going through a lot in the 1960s and early 70s. Activism was at a high level. We had the Mau Mau, we had the Republic of New Africa, we had the Black United Front, we had the Black Student Federation, we had the Black Panthers. So SNCC Corps, just a whole lot of black organizations trying to change the educational opportunity paradigm of Boston. And then here comes the Black Student Federation in 1971 saying that, guess what? The school system is not doing what it should and ought to do for black students, and we're going to boycott the school system. We're going to bring to the attention of the government, meaning the school committee, the city council, and others, the importance of providing educational equality and educational opportunity for African American or black students. And by the way, here's the interesting part of this whole conversation is that we were able, after 1 month, to induce the support of white students who found the same pain as we did. And that is the lack of educational opportunity for all. So the bottom line is that we worked hard to address the challenges of educational opportunity in Boston by essentially motivating others to engage in the process of sounding the alarm on the way the Boston school system was addressing education and education equality in Boston.
A lot of our members, especially our younger persons, are interested in the history of the Black Panther Party,
Mm-hmm.
Republic of New Africa, the
Mm-hmm.
Mau Mau, and I was wondering if you could kind of talk about those organizations and their presence in Boston, and if they had a role too in sort of this larger student movement at the time.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that you asked that because all the groups that I just mentioned had a significant role in organizing the effort of making sure that we addressed the black students, address what was important for the black community. So, as an example, the Boston branch, or yeah, the Boston branch of the Black Panther Party was intimately involved in planning um, for the boycott because members of the Black Panther Party were invited to participate in strategy sessions on how to make sure that the black students were safe during we had demonstrations at the Boston School Committee on, I believe it is on Winter Street or School Street at the time. We would we would walk all the way from Roxbury, from Dorchester, from Mattapan, from Jamaica Plain, from Hyde Park. Can you imagine walking from Hyde Park High School all the way downtown? Jamaica Plain, all the way downtown. Jeremiah Burke, all the way downtown. So, with the Black Student Federation, we were concerned about the safety of black students. We wanted to have a group of people that would protect the black students, particularly the black females. Because we knew how the school system was. We knew how the Boston Police Department was at the time, and maybe still is now, and we wanted protection. We used the Black Panther Party as that vehicle because they had folks that were pretty militant looking, and they were no joke. And it was like, hey, let's have them participate in our event. And by the way, let us engage them because they had political education classes at the Black Panther Party, and so we wanted to make sure that the population that we were serving had a political understanding of what all this mean, what we were doing. So we asked the Black Panther Party to come on in to be participants in the political education process for the students. Wow, it was beautiful. It was amazing. And then we said, well, we also have the Republic of New Africa here. And the Republic of New Africa is a group that existed in the 1960s and 70s. And essentially, it was a separatist organization. They wanted to change the dynamic of what was going on in the country and say, all you folks that are in Boston, move to the South. All you folks that are in Chicago and Detroit, move to the South. We will create a plebiscite or a place where black folks are going to live in the southern states and then have everybody else live in other states. But we want to take over Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, and other places. They were a radical organization, extremely radical, and a separatist organization. And so we asked them to share their experiences in education process to educate the black students about the importance of self identity. And so that's where they came in. And we also had the Republic of North Africa, the Black Panthers, and then we had the support of the Black United Front. And the Black United Front was an umbrella organization of essentially black activist organizations throughout the city. And this Black United Front had a lot of money because the bottom line is back in that day, there were people that were given money to black institutions. And the Black United Front was the vehicle to give to black institutions. They created a Black United Front Foundation. So we got money to operate the Black Student Union from the Black United Front Foundation. This organization was run by, guess what? Chuck Turner. And he was an activist at the time, and he actually supported us as well. So we had groups from across the city, black institutions from across the city, from the NAACP that was relatively conservative, except for the leader at the time, because I told you about the experience with Jackie Robinson. He was less than not conservative at all, but he supported us. So we had the conservative NAACP, Urban League head, Otto and Muriel Snowden at the Freedom House, which was a very conservative black leaders of the time. They were hooked up with Senator Brooke, Republican, the middle of the road black guy, first um, uh, black U.S. senator before after Reconstruction. So we had a whole host of folks from the right, from the left, and in between in Boston's black community supporting us.
Wow. So another part of this that is significant is the idea of community control of schools and of really of taking control of institutions in Black communities. Was that idea also prominent in the movement at the time?
Yes, actually, it was. And the organizations that existed at the time supported us as well. So when we think of, what do you call it, the couple of the organizations that established New School for Children, which was a effort on the part of blacks to educate our own through creating our own schools and our own institutions. That was the impetus of other maturer black leaders of the time, because we were still young. We were 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. Even in the college, on the college campuses, we were 18, 19, 20 at the most. So we weren't the maturest. We were mature, but we weren't the maturest group that would establish these nonprofit, excuse me, these nonprofit yet educational institutions such as New School for Children. And the New School for Children, they were the first group of folks that said, hey, guess what? You all are boycotting? Good. Come over to the New School for Children and we'll set up education programs for you while you are out of school. So, New School for Children, they embodied what we were doing and said, hey, guess what? Even though we're dealing with the children, we support you. And you can use our space as a place to continue to learn.
Yeah, that's incredible because I feel like that's something that in the present day we don't see a type of like really like a mass movement in that way where you have unity between some of the more like conservative organizations or the more left-leaning organizations, and then also this kind of like multitude of different community groups as well also supporting this radical push in the district and in the city of Boston.
Right.
um, and this is also too, I think it's kind of, this is the history that like busing sits on top of in a way, because busing is something that is more commonly known about and taught,
Mm-hmm.
but what's missing is really like this piece of the story, that leads us to busing, which also in
Right.
itself is incredible.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if you can kind of speak about what is this space between like our student boycott 71, the demands being agreed to essentially, and then what leads into busing, what's happening during that period of time.
Yeah, good point and good question. The you are right. This movement, this 1968 to 73 movement, was a movement of black students to lead the effort for educational opportunity. Period. And there was a void to some degree on the part of adult black leadership during that time, essentially scratching its head and saying, we don't know what to do. We have the racial imbalance law that we pushed. We have the black students that have been pushing us and prodding us, prodding the school system, prodding the mayor, prodding the city council. And we have a gap that is huge and large from 1968 to 73, where the voices of discontent had only been the black students. The leadership, the larger big picture leadership, was kind of stuck in place. It was like, we have Metco and it's working, but we are not holding the school system accountable, and we don't have a structure in place to actually organize. We have the NAACP, we have, um, a number of nonprofits, but we don't know. I don't know if there was just a brain stoppage of some type where they forgot how to organize. And so we, meaning the black students, stood in the gap and said, hey, guess what? We're going to be the organizing vehicle. And in many ways, if I'm looking from the outside in at Boston today in 2021 going on 22, the same dilemma is in fact the case, where you have a bunch of nonprofits working on education, but in terms of organizing, it doesn't exist. The only organizing that exists to any large degree is the students saying, enough. We can't allow you, school system, to have us be guinea pigs in Jamaica Plain with some program that gets contract after contract to do goofy things that aren't appropriate. We can't do that. And in fact, one of the school committee members saying, "I'm done with this. I'm resigning. But before I resign, I'm going to educate the public to what is going on." So I salute him and I salute the students that actually said enough is enough. So in reality, what is going on in 2020, 2018, 2019 is the same things that had happened, wow, some 50 years ago. In other words, everything has changed and nothing has changed. That's how I feel, and I could be right. I probably am in this situation, but I could be wrong too. But, in terms of the whole issue of, you know, how did the challenges of 1969, 70, 71, 72, 73 turn out to be the gap time in which we, as black students in the black community, began to say enough is enough was because of the NAACP and Tom Atkins, who led the NAACP at the time, along with others on the NAACP board, saying, in reality, thank you very much, black students. You brought the issue of educational inequality to the public in a big way. And because of that, we want to move on and charge the school system with racial discrimination and racial imbalance. And we're calling for school desegregation now. And we want the school system to come up with a plan, but they have been unwilling to come up with a plan. So, therefore, what we'd love to do, and that's what they did, is submit a lawsuit into the United States District Court in Massachusetts and have Judge Garrity, who was appointed to be leading that effort as a judge, to come up with a plan to desegregate the city of Boston schools with the advisal of black teachers, black students, and black leaders. And I was glad to help as a black student leader at the time, and asked by both the NAACP president at the time, the late Thomas Atkins, and Otto and Muriel Snowden of the Freedom House to be a active supporter of school desegregation and sit on a working committee that would address the issues of students, parents, and teachers moving forward. So that gap, that challenge was understood by those leaders at the time, that gap in student organizing, that gap in teacher organizing, that gap in parent organizing. And they learned from us, in many ways, best practices on how to motivate students, how to educate our and motivate our parents, and how to educate and motivate our community. So that was the impetus. That was the way in which we began to address the issue of educational inequality during the late 1960s, early 70s, and the whole issue of the racial imbalance law and school segregation in Boston was an issue of black and white as far as we were concerned. When I say black and white, we were concerned about other ethnic groups, obviously, but at the same time, the most important group that we were concerned about was the black community, the African American community of Boston, and making sure that voices be heard in educational uh, challenges that we had to address. And I'll tell you, the biggest voices that were heard were, thank goodness, black teachers, black students, and black parents during the school desegregation era. That era beginning in 1974 with Judge Garrity throwing down the gauntlet and saying that black students and black teachers and black administrators and others had to be involved in the planning process for school desegregation, and that the school committee had to come up with, after taking over the schools, that the school department had to come up with a hiring process for more black teachers. Thank God, and that the school system had to come up alternative education approaches. When I say alternative education approaches, the whole issue of black studies and black guidance counselors, more administrators in the school system, from the rooter to the tutor. When I say from the rooter to the tutor, I'm talking about making sure that black folks were involved and hired educationally in Boston.
Relating the sort of experience leading up to busing, right? That's kind of
Right, right,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I did. I just covered during the gap was a leadership void in Boston, a black leadership void with regards to knowing how to best practice teacher organizing, student organizing, and parent organizing. Parents were critical, teachers were critical. Their conversations had to be part of the, school desegregation effort. And we stood in the gap. The students, the black students, stood in the gap during that period, but we had to lead by example. We had learned how to organize with students based on the experiences of Ellen Jackson and others in organizing during the 1960s. But it seemed as though they forgot how to do it. So we stayed focused and began to be the group that stood in the gap. So when Ellen Jackson and others asked for um, parent input, it was us that already knew who the parents were because we knew this before. So we were able to bring the parents in to the school desegregation effort. The same thing with the teachers. We were the motivating force for many of the black teachers to support our efforts in terms of actually, demonstrating and boycotting. So they were able to communicate with the teachers based on our experience of working with the black teachers, working with the Beam organization and others. And so everything was relying on us to do the good work, even though we didn't get paid. All the adults got paid. We didn't get
Mhm.
paid. Yeah, but the adults got paid, were able to write contracts and grants and ask for money from the Boston Foundation and from other foundations to actually get money into their coffers. I wish the student union, student federation didn't do the same.
This is a thing too. I wanted to kind of get a sense of. Did you continue on with the Black Student Federation work into the period of time that busing takes place?
Yes, I did. Yes, yes, yes. I did actually. As I was saying, it may have stopped in terms of footage. But the bottom line is that I continued as the head of the Black Student Federation all the way up, if I'm not mistaken, until 75 was about the year that I 75 for yeah about 75 or early 76. I stopped working for the Black Student Federation. Um, yeah, so I was actively involved with the organization for a long time, and they actually, um, I'm talking about Ellen Jackson and the Freedom House and others, even the city of Boston, and working with then Mayor White. They relied on me to give them the real deal on how black students were feeling, and in many ways, how black parents were feeling as well.
Right. So, in terms of, I think this is a thing too that is kind of important in terms of thinking about this like larger history of this of the really, I mean, the movement to create an entirely different education system in Boston.
Hmm.
Um, we have the build up into the actual like desegregation busing,
Hmm.
and I feel like if we look at it from right now, it
Hmm.
seems like Boston public schools still have a form of de facto segregation.
Definitely,
And it would be hard to deny that.
no
It'd be
question.
very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, could you maybe give your take on it? Like, how is it that busing essentially wasn't able to actually uh, materially desegregate the school system? Like, how do we get from like the busing movement in the '70s to today, where things don't really look that different? We could say that even certain schools have a specific demographic
Hmm.
attached to them,
Right.
and even funding, even the ways that facilities appear,
Hmm.
resources in those schools um, appear, from the persons that are there. It's that we still see this legacy of segregation in Boston in the present. Like, what happens with busing that essentially doesn't fundamentally resolve that issue, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, school desegregation was never going to be successful in Boston, and has not been successful in Boston because of the negative energy created by politicals. Similar to we find ourselves in with COVID-19. There was a politician in the White House that made decisions and activated a group of the American population that now is against masks and now is against the shot. And the same thing happened with school desegregation, is that there were politicians locally that were against school desegregation. That's the whole Boston School Committee. And there were politicians, including the mayor, who was a failure at implementing school desegregation. School desegregation in Boston was a violent act, period. It was violent. And the violence was perpetrated by folks in the political class that brought it down to the local neighborhoods of Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, essentially those three major desegregation points. And with that in mind, um, there was a win lose situation. It was a win for the black community in many ways to say, hey, guess what? We're going to desegregate the city of Boston schools, but it was a lose lose situation for the black community as well, because we knew from the beginning that these folks in South Boston, Charlestown, and East Boston were never, as they said, never ever going to allow their kids to go to schools in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. We will move out of the city first. That's what their refrain was, and that's what they did. They moved out of the city, moved to the South Shore, moved to other parts of Quincy, moved to other parts of out of Boston, and with that in mind, school desegregation was a losing proposition because the population shift was majority Latinos moving into the city and whites moving out. And with that move out, caused the success of school desegregation to negated. That all the work and planning for school desegregation and stopping the de facto segregation in Boston was not realized because of the fact that people moved. And that was a decision that political class leaders in South Boston, East Boston, and Charlestown fueled. The Pixie Palace, the other folks that became leaders in South Boston at the time, those folks were ardent, not advocates, but folks that just did not want to see blacks and whites come together.
Right.
That's it. So, yeah, the school system was not wanting to have a real desegregation of the city of Boston schools. And the whole challenge of education, no inequality, um, was not a issue or problem for the school system. They were in denial stage, extreme denial stage. But the Boston NAACP, supported by some parents and supported by um, uh, leaders, began the school legal process. And I'll tell you, um, although I was actually, I was appointed to the NAACP as a youth advisor to the NAACP by Tom Atkins. And my advice to the NAACP was uh, to actually take a second look at this whole strategy of school desegregation after the uh, assaults and battery that the students experienced day after day during the initial stages of school desegregation, where adults were throwing rocks at buses, where students were in and students getting injured by glass and flying objects in South Boston and other places in the Boston community. I urged the NAACP chair, essentially Tom Atkins, to rethink school desegregation because this was a battleground. This was similar to attempting to desegregate the school system in the deepest of southern communities. It was worse than Mississippi, Alabama, and other places in between. These folks were assaulting little children, and we shouldn't have this. So I advocated differently from the NAACP after the incidents of violence. And actually, I did serve as a school monitor over in South Boston for a minute. And after the violence that was perpetrated against black students, I called for an immediate stop of the school desegregation effort, or that the mayor of the city of Boston actually call on the National Guard to be on the streets of Boston to protect black students. Um, in a meeting with the mayor at his house, I advocated for that. And unfortunately, the mayor balked at that recommendation that I made directly to the mayor, Mayor Kevin H. White at the time. Actually supported by a number of the members in the leadership of the community at the time. Uh, I know that Ellen Jackson supported it. I know that Otto and Muriel Snowden had conversations with the mayor asking for federal troops to be brought in. It was a crazy time in Boston, all because black students wanted, and black parents and black leadership wanted a school system that was not segregated based on the color of one's skin. And we worked hard over that period of time to address the issues of inequality. And one of the most important aspects of
our demands was the important um, concern that black students and other students, all students, needed to know about the very important impact that blacks had on educational, um, let us say, um, excellence in the public school systems across the country, and the importance of blacks in um, the history books, and the fact that um, in Boston, which is the cradle of um, the educational experience, because it's the first public school system was created in Boston, that Boston was failing at F grade in relationship to creating opportunities for black students as well as other students to learn black history, which we thought coming out of the 1960s and early 70s was important for black and other students to begin to learn about the black experience in America. And even today, it appears that that issue of black, um, uh, for the lack of a better word, black education, black history, um, is not at the forefront of administrators' interest in the Boston Public Schools. Sad that in 2021, going into the school year 2022, we find ourselves in this challenge predicament of folks doing the same thing and expecting different results. And doing the same thing is actually not including black history in the school system, black studies. Um, Actually, why is that not happening now? I mean, 50 years later, we find ourselves in the same situation that we found ourselves many years ago. I say all that to say that I support and respect black students and all other students that are taking up the issue of, black studies, black education, black history in the Boston Public Schools, and the need for black education, black history, black studies in the Boston Public Schools. It's a long time coming. I'm so happy that the leadership inside the city of Boston schools, particularly the black students, are saying, hey, guess what? It is time for change. It's 2021, 22, and we're expecting great things out of the Boston Public School System. We're expecting great things out of the superintendent of schools. We're expecting great things out of administrators. And just do your job and do it well. And that is provide opportunities for all students to learn in a environment that is supportive of black students and other minority students throughout the educational process. So, from elementary school all the way up to graduation in high school and places in between, um, make sure that the Boston Public Schools does its job and does it well. It's about that time.